Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilmette Institute's webinar, Navigating the Urgent Transition Towards Sustainability. We are delighted that the webinar is co-sponsored by the Graduate Theological Union's Sustainability 360 program, and we look forward to opportunities to work with them in the future. A word quickly about the Wilmette Institute. We were established in 1995 and have offered online non-credit courses since 1998, over 700 of them to date, to over 18,000 people. We started offering credit courses in 2016 through articulation and affiliation agreements with various higher education institutions. Our climate change and sustainable development faculty team has offered a non-credit course on climate change 11 times since 2013, and a non-credit sustainable development course 12 times since 2005, to a total of perhaps 1,000 registrants. These students have taken their learning back to their towns and neighborhoods and have strengthened many local efforts to reduce the human contributions to climate change and to live more sustainable lives. This fall, the Wilmette Institute will offer a course titled Human Prosperity and Sustainable Development for credit through the Graduate Theological Union. It will be one of 3 courses we plan to offer this fall through GTU. The other 2 are Baha'i History, 1844 to 2022, and Social Transformation, Baha'i Perspectives. 2 of the members of our Climate Change and Sustainable Development team are present today, Dr. Laurent Mesbah and Dr. Arthur Dahl.
Thank you, Robert, for the introduction. So I'm Laurent Mesbah. So I'm going to facilitate the webinar today for the presentation that Arthur Dahl will make. So Dr. Arthur Dahl was born in California, where he studied biology and completed his PhD in marine biology at the University of California in 1969. He continued doing research work at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and did field work on coral reefs in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Dr. Dahl represented the Baha'i international community at the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972, 50 years ago, and he will take part in Stockholm Plus 50 this year in June. He will be one of the few participants who were actually present in the initial conference on the environment. In 1974, Dr. Dahl became the regional ecological advisor to all the Pacific Island countries in the Pacific community, where he organized the Pacific Regional Environment Program. He then joined the UN Environment Program in Nairobi, Kenya, as Deputy Director of the Oceans and Coastal Areas Program, before serving in the Secretariat of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit to prepare Agenda 21, the Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development, and then coordinating the UN system-wide Earth Watch from Geneva, Switzerland, where he is still based. Dr. Dahl has been president of the International Environment Forum, a Baha'i-inspired organization for environment and sustainability, since 1997. He is also on the governing board of another Baha'i-inspired organization, EBBF, Ethical Business Building the Future. Arthur Dahl has published in many scientific papers, but also much on environment, global policy topics. He has published also a number of books, among which one in which he co-authored on global governance, published recently. Arthur Dahl has published, Arthur Dahl is also initiator and faculty for this upcoming course for credit on human prosperity and sustainable development, as Dr. Robert Stockman indicated. So the presentation will last around 40 minutes, after which we will have some time for question and answers and comments. So we're really glad to have you here, Arthur Dahl. It's a It's an honor and a privilege to have you here. So welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much to all of you to join us this evening. I hope my presentation doesn't depress you too much at the beginning, because we're facing many challenges, and I'll summarize those briefly, but I sometimes have to give a health warning that might be dangerous to your health to begin to consider all the challenges that we're facing. So we're saying, how do we navigate these challenges that we're facing to go towards sustainability as quickly as possible because of the urgency of many of the problems that we're facing today? We have multiple interconnected crises, not only the environmental crisis, we've got a health crisis, economic crises, governance crises, crises of religion, and even a war. Or maybe say, are these the four horsemen of the apocalypse? We've got pestilence with COVID-19 and its dead and social chaos. The climate and biodiversity catastrophes are leading to widespread death of man and nature. Famine is on the horizon, and now we have war too. On the environmental crisis, we know that we're overshooting planetary boundaries. I'll come back to that. But with climate change, we only have a few years to turn the corner. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just released the third part of its report, telling us there are still a few ways forward, but only if we can make very rapid changes in all parts of our society will we be able to avoid catastrophic climate change, which could create enormous problems. We have the collapse of biodiversity. Already in Europe, 80% of the insect biomass has been destroyed, largely by the use of pesticides and habitat destruction. We've lost 60% of the vertebrates in the world. 1 million species out of 8 million are now in danger of extinction. We're seeing land degradation on a very large scale, deforestation, water shortages in many parts of the world. We have plastic pollution, all sorts of chemicals, 10,000 chemicals released into the environment. Urban air pollution kills millions of people. Just on the environmental side, a whole series of challenges. On the economic crises, we've got the poor now hit by rising prices. We need to transform all the energy systems behind our economy. We see growing unemployment in many places. We have an increase in extreme wealth while failing to address poverty. So the economy is not responding to the needs of most of the people. We even have the crisis from unrelated businesses, giant multinational profit-driven corporations with great power and monopoly positions in the world and no international regulation. They block progress with their powerful lobbies and feed widespread corruption. We have social crises, failures of trust and trustworthiness. Who believes in telling the truth today, especially among politicians? We have fragmentation and loss of social cohesion. Racism is still prevalent in many places. We're failing to achieve gender equality, neglect of many marginalized groups, and we can see more and more manipulation by political extremists and populists. The health crisis, of course, the pandemic is the most immediate one, and we've seen how it's allowed private gain over public health, as the pharmaceutical companies have made enormous profits selling their vaccines to the rich and ignoring the poor who can't afford to pay for them. We need to see that we've only got a single global system today. Natural borders have lost their meaning. The virus travels everywhere. So only global solidarity could save the world from drawn-out suffering. And this is a lesson we're having difficulty in learning. The technological crises. We've got all these fantastic innovations in technology that support both bad and good ends. The social media connect all of us, which is wonderful. But the industry leaders are free to trap us for their profit. We see them creating online worlds of superficial pleasure and distraction, playing on confirmation bias and manipulation to attract larger audiences to the advertising on their platforms. We have the crisis in governance, failures in general in governments around the world. Failures in democracy, failures in taking decisions. Governments sign up to beautiful promises at the United Nations on sustainable development and then fail to deliver. We see widespread corruption, loss of trust, and a retreat of peace and security today. So we're not doing very well on the government side either. And of course, behind this is the crisis in multilateralism. As long as we maintain the paradigm of absolute national sovereignty, this means there always will be free rider nations who will undercut even those enlightened multilateral action. Even if most governments want to implement sustainable goals, there are always those who have other interests or are already corrupted and ignore them and continue to take us in the wrong direction. So we have these multiple interacting crises. Even religion was intended to bring love and fellowship, but is used instead to fan hatred. And now we're plunged into war as well. And all of these express fundamental failures in ethics, values, morality, and spirituality. So that's really the root of our problem. We're working with the wrong values or a complete lack of values, a vacuum in values today. So this is an ethical and spiritual challenge. And we'll review some of the challenges that we're facing, and what's really causing these problems I've just been describing. We were warned about this over 100 years ago by the founder of the Baha'i faith, who said, the civilization so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. The day is approaching when its flame will devour the cities. We're seeing some examples of that in Ukraine at the moment, unfortunately. Do we have a population problem? People say, well, the problem is too many people. Yes, the population has tripled in my lifetime. But despite this great increase in wealth, half the people of the world still struggle to make ends meet. And it is poverty that drives the rapid population growth. If you reduce inequality and educate women and girls, the population stabilizes. So what's wrong? We've overshot the planet's carrying capacity, and we're rapidly degrading the natural environment and resources upon which our future and that of future generations depend. This is nothing new. Back in 1972, a group of young scientists at MIT published a report for the Clubs of Rome called Limits to Growth. They did a computer model of where the world was going in terms of resources and industry and population and food and life, all of this. And they showed that business as usual from 1900 to 2000, 2100, we would do quite well until about 2020, 2030, and then civilization would collapse because we would have reached the limits to growth on a finite planet. They redid the study for the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and they were able to show that if we made the change then, we could stabilize the system and have a relatively sustainable future. But they warned us if we waited until 2015 to make that change, we couldn't avoid a major catastrophe in mid-century, and the quality of life possible would be much less because it would have destroyed more of the planet's resources. So these were computer models, and people laughed at them at the time. Oh, that's just a fabrication. But scientists went back to say, how close were they to predicting what actually has happened? And in fact, we're right on track to collapse. We're doing slightly better on birth and death rates. Everything else is following the curves exactly as predicted. The only thing that has changed is that a stabilized scenario with sustainability without a crisis is no longer a practical possibility. And scientists were warning us about this. There was a recent, 2 years ago, scientists warning in which they said it's really those of us who are the most affluent who are at fault. The most significant impact on the environment and sustainability comes from the wealthy and our society of abundance. Our materialistic consumption is not compensated by advances in technology. The only way we can avoid the climate and biodiversity catastrophes is through a significant reduction in our lifestyle and GDP in the Western economies, with all the losses in employment and changes in our economic model that this implies. We must rethink our communities from the bottom up and simplify our ways of living. But this is the scientists speaking. They see the reality and they say it is those of us who are living the best who are causing the problem and must make the most significant efforts to bring about the change that is needed. And of course, the Baha'i writings and the guidance of our international governing body have said very much the same thing. They showed, the problem is very much in our economy and our market system. When they wrote, having penetrated and captured all significant centers of power and information at the global level, dogmatic materialism ensured that no competing voices would retain the ability to challenge projects of worldwide economic exploitation. And again, all too many of these man-made ideologies callously abandon starving millions to the operations of a market system that all too clearly is aggravating the plight of the majority of mankind, while enabling small sections to live in a condition of affluence scarcely dreamed of by our forebears. They've recently told us the economic life of humanity has recently embroiled so many people. Injustice is tolerated with indifference, and disproportionate gain is regarded as the emblem of success. And also, the son of the founder wrote, among the teachings of Baha'u'llah are justice and right. Until these are realized on the plane of existence, all things shall be in disorder and remain imperfect. The world of mankind is a world of oppression and cruelty and a realm of aggression and error. Obviously, if we don't have any kind of spiritual foundation to change from this animal nature. Again, the finger is pointed at our consumer culture. Materialism's gospel of human betterment produced today's consumer culture pursuing ephemeral goals. For the small minority of people who can afford them, the benefits it offers are immediate and the rationale unapologetic. The breakdown of traditional morality has led to the triumph of animal impulse, as instinctive and blind as appetite. Selfishness becomes a prized commercial resource. Falsehood reinvents itself as public information. Greed, lust, indolence, pride, even violence acquire not merely broad acceptance, but social and economic value. So this is really how sick our society is today. And again, the House of Justice has said, today the world is assailed by an array of destructive forces. Materialism rooted in the West has now spread to every corner of the planet, breeding in the name of a strong global economy and human welfare, a culture of consumerism. It skillfully and ingeniously promotes a habit of consumption that seeks to satisfy the basest and most selfish desires, while encouraging the expenditure of wealth so as to prolong and exacerbate social conflict. One result is a deepening confusion on the part of young people everywhere, a sense of hopelessness in the ranks of those who would drive progress, and the emergence of a myriad social maladies. We really have a very sick society today. It's continued, the time has come when those who preach the dogmas of materialism, whether of the East or of the West, whether of capitalism or socialism, must give account of the moral stewardship they have presumed to exercise. Why is the vast majority of the world's peoples sinking ever deeper into hunger and wretchedness? So the problem is really with our market economics. The neoclassical economic paradigm of the market cultivates this consumer society. It sees the environmental and socialism as externalities, somebody else's problem. In the market, everything is property to generate profit, and so you privatize as much as you can. This favors those with the ability to pay, and therefore the rich over the poor. At the same time, it consumes natural resources by the rate of return on investment, not the rate of regeneration of those resources, and therefore raping the planet. Economic accounting ignores human well-being or what people really care for. The result is this extreme concentration of wealth, while half the world's population struggles and poverty persists in so many places. So, in a sense, we've institutionalized greed. The principal measure of success is wealth, personal wealth or national wealth measured in GDP. Corporate success is profit, return on capital, and stock market valuation that generate wealth. And while we condemn individual behavior that is so greedy, selfish, and aggressive that it injures others, we do not see as easily how these values are incorporated in our institutions, particularly traditional corporations. So it's sort of built into the system itself. Corporate greed is institutionalized to maximize profits. The ends justify any means. Such institutions have no conscience, no moral framework, or sense of humanity to restrain them. They become too big for individuals to have an impact on them. They drive climate change, biodiversity destruction, massive pollution, human exploitation, extremes of poverty and wealth, the arms race, the privatization of knowledge and science, and most of the other ills that have escaped from any control. So governments should be ensuring the common good. That's what we have governments for. But corporate lobbies and corruption now control most governments. There's no global governance for non-state entities like corporations. We can sign all the treaties and conventions we want, but they only apply to states, not to companies. Multilateral cooperation among states for human rights and environment fails in implementation because they have no influence over those with the real power today in the economic system. And of course, this calls them back again to those market values. The Universal House of Justice said certain approaches to obtaining wealth, so many of which involve the exploitation of others, the monopolization and manipulation of markets, and the production of goods that promote violence and immorality, are unworthy and unacceptable, but extremely current today, unfortunately. So it's clear that there's no going back. The past is no guide to the future. I hope not, anyway. That future has yet to be invented. And so I hope I haven't depressed you too much. Let's look at the more positive side of things. But first, we have the world scientist warning about what we have to change immediately if we want to avoid the catastrophes that are coming in 6 areas. For energy, we must eliminate fossil fuels and shift to renewables. For the short-lived air pollutants, we've got to slash black carbon or soot, methane emissions, and hydrofluorocarbons. With respect to nature, we need to restore and permanently protect the Earth's ecosystems to store and accumulate carbon and restore biodiversity. For food, we need to switch to the mostly plant-based diets, reducing food waste and improving cropping practices. For the economy, we need to move from indefinite GDP growth and overconsumption by the wealthy to ecological economics and a circular economy in which prices reflect the full environmental costs of goods and services. The human population, we can stabilize it and gradually reduce it by providing voluntary family planning and supporting education and rights for all girls and young women. And so all transformative climate action should focus on social justice for all, by prioritizing basic human needs, reducing inequality. This is what scientists have laid out very briefly as the challenges we must face immediately. So let's try to imagine the future we want. Some questions. We have to start by questioning our assumptions. Are we really inherently aggressive and competitive in the struggle to win out over others? Is that basic human nature or just the animal side of us? Is life a zero-sum game where winning means that someone else must be the loser? What about our gender stereotypes? What about our identities based on racism, on nationalism, and religious bigotry, which have deep roots in our subconscious? We inherit so much without questioning that it requires a significant effort to bring ourselves to account each day. So some things to consider, look to the future. What physical characteristics of the world we want to build and live in? Should it be ugly or beautiful? Should it be full of nature, whatever? How should our human systems relate and integrate with the natural systems of the biosphere instead of being just separate from them? What should be the qualities of our communities? What social relationships? What systems of organization and governance are required from the local to the global levels? How would the economy function? What would be everybody's rights and responsibilities? And most fundamentally, if you really want to change a system, what would be the underlying principles and values to guide this ever-evolving system? And what wisdom from older generations might be useful? What new wisdom from a very different world can we bring to our discussions? Is there a role for religion? What future do we want to invent? Lots of questions that I hope you will keep with you far beyond this presentation, because that's really how we can consider our way forward. We're living in a time of disintegration and integration. We acknowledge we have to face real difficulties. The immediate future looks pretty grim, and it seems to get grimmer every day. There seems to be no immediate end to the crises and catastrophes that we're facing. For the moment, the negative side of human nature is dominating our economic, political, and social frameworks. And the processes of disintegration are continuing. But new forces of integration can pick up momentum. Building now will help to speed the transition and make it less painful. So the more we do to go in the right direction, the more we can soften the transition that we ultimately have to face ahead. So let's focus on hope. It's a rare commodity in today's world, but we can be positive, full of creative imagination, drawing on the fantastic potential hiding within each of us. And of course, youth in particular, are the hope of the future. Today will only be a start, but tomorrow is already the future. So the more we build forward, the more that future will open up. And Baha'is around the world are trying in a small way to set an example of how that might work. If you want to know more about this idea of hope, I've written a book on the subject, which can be available for those who are interested. So you clearly need a more spiritual approach to address all of these challenges that I've been describing. Again, the Universal Office of Justice has said, to alleviate a variety of problems born of the economic inequalities so prevalent in the world today, social and economic development will require, especially among the younger generations, a fundamental shift in perspective, one that changes the way in which certain essential concepts are viewed: the true purpose of life, the nature of progress, the meaning of true happiness and well-being, and the place that material pursuits should assume in one's individual and family life. Social justice will be attained only when every member of society enjoys a relative degree of material prosperity, that means eliminating poverty, and gives due regard to the acquisition of spiritual qualities. The solution then to prevailing economic difficulties is to be sought as much in the application of spiritual principles as in the implementation of scientific methods and approaches. So let's try to rethink economics from a Baha'i perspective. Again, I'll share a few quotations from the Baha'i, the writings and the Baha'i international community. There's an inherent moral dimension to the generation, distribution, and utilization of wealth and resources. The stresses emerging out of a long-term process of transition from a divided world to a united one are being felt within international relations as much as in the deepening fractures that affect societies large and small. With prevailing modes of thought found to be badly wanting, the world is in desperate need of a shared ethic, a sure framework for addressing the crises that gather like storm clouds, and some of those seem to be breaking at the moment. The vision of Baha'u'llah challenges many of the assumptions that are allowed to shape contemporary discourse. For instance, that self-interest, far from needing to be restrained, drives prosperity, and that progress depends on its expression through relentless competition. To view the worth of an individual cheaply in terms of how much one can accumulate and how many goods one can consume relative to others is wholly alien to Baha'i thought. Wealth must serve humanity. Its use must accord with spiritual principles. Systems must be created in their light. And in Baha'u'llah's memorable words, no light can compare with the light of justice. The establishment of order in the world and the tranquility of the nations depend upon it. So society must develop new economic models. Resources must be directed to furthering a dynamic, just, and thriving social order. Such economic systems will be strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature. They will provide meaningful employment and will help to eradicate poverty in the world. So there we have, in a couple of sentences, you might say the design principles for a new economic system, how it should be and what it should be aiming to do. The House of Justice continues, the economic life of humanity has recently embroiled so many people. Injustice is tolerated with indifference, disproportionate gain regarded as the emblem of success. Nevertheless, there are certainly practices anyone could eschew, such as dishonesty in one's transactions or the economic exploitation of others. There should be no contradiction between one's economic conduct and one's beliefs. By applying in one's life principles of fairness and equity, each person can uphold a standard far above the low threshold by which the world measures itself. Humanity is weary for want of a pattern of life to which to aspire. We should aim for actions in our communities which will give hope to the world. And this is where we can really start in our own local communities and try to set an example at that level. The members of the younger generation would do well to ponder the difference between gaining wealth through earnest effort in fields such as agriculture, commerce, the arts, and industry on the one hand, and on the other, obtaining it without exertion or through dishonorable means. Let them consider the consequences of each for the spiritual development of the individual, as well as the progress of society, and ask themselves what possibilities exist for generating income and acquiring wealth that will ensure true happiness through the development of spiritual qualities such as honesty, trustworthiness, generosity, justice, and consideration for others, and the recognition that material means are to be expended for the betterment of the world. The community is a building block of the global arena. It can provide a space where alternative, inclusive, and cooperative ways of life can find expression, where men wholeheartedly come to see women as equal partners, and all are empowered to develop leadership abilities. Through moral education programs, attitudes of unity and fellowship are instilled from a young age, so that participants come to view each other as valued allies, working for the well-being of their communities. So we can already do a lot in our own communities to begin with. Central to the process is the concept of capacity building, of enhancing the ability of participants to better understand the material, social, and spiritual realities of their societies, and to devise next steps as they collectively chart their own path of progress, deriving fulfillment through service. Toward this end, spaces have organically emerged for individuals to reflect together on their challenges, identify constructive responses, and explore deeper questions related to the meaning of life. These spaces can serve as arenas where hope in times of difficulty finds expression, and bonds of solidarity can strengthen. The capacities, attitudes, and qualities characterizing a community can reinforce its resilience in the face of extreme events and ongoing environmental burdens, such as those I described earlier in this presentation. So, one of the things we have to address is governance. And we have both guidance from the United Nations in our common agenda and guidance from the Baha'i international community and some Baha'i thinking on the subject. The governance problem, of course, is very clear. With national sovereignty, war is the final recourse to impose one state's will on others. And we have a very clear demonstration of that at the moment. We have therefore international anarchy. There's no rule of law. The United Nations' hands are bound because the veto means that the most powerful can prevent any interference with their own desires. We see the struggle for power and world domination, a pushback against multilateralism. Warfare is increasingly dangerous to the survival of the human race. And as I mentioned, multinational corporations are out of control. The world is filled with ego, corruption, and aggression, with a rise of reckless political leaders and autocrats. So clearly, governance is a very, very sick situation. So society needs good governance if we want justice and the common good. We want to build unity and concord at the local, national, global levels. Too much politics today is based on self-interest, fragmentation, and conflict. And the failures of governance cause many of today's problems. National sovereignty becomes the shield to hide leaders' misdoings and corruption. And we see politics dominated by established elites, the rich and powerful, corrupt kleptocrats, and especially old men. And if part of the problem, of course, as I mentioned, is with corporations. We have this governance gap in the corporate sector, which escapes from national government control, putting all those profits in, tax-free havens and so on and so forth. We need a global legal framework for business and the corporate sector. Non-state economic actors such as corporations should be required to include in their legal charters an obligation for social and environmental responsibility to perform some useful service for society, in addition to profit as a measure of economic efficiency. That's not the case today. The corporate leaders are expected to create profits for the shareholders, and nothing else is written in the legal charter, except in a few decorporations. There are some corporates trying to do better, but for most today, and they hide behind that, to continue their selfish ways. By doing this, by requiring them to include this in the legal charters, this would empower them to be effective partners in the system-wide challenges facing the world. So, how do we encourage the forces of integration? We need ethics, values, goals, and perspectives of a better world, better future. We need a vision of a more just and equitable world, able to motivate positive actions. So, can an ethical, even spiritual perspective help us to change our lifestyle and consumption patterns? We have the UN 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals that give us a framework for action. Governments have already agreed to what needs to be done. But we need institutions of strong global governance for these global problems, which lacks at the moment. You must already be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, but they include everything from poverty to gender equality to reducing inequalities, addressing the environmental problems and peace and justice. Everything is there that we need to do. And of course, Secretary General, in his report last September on our common agenda, also highlighted the kinds of changes that are needed. First, he said, now is the time to re-embrace global solidarity and to find new ways to work together for the common good. It must include urgent and bold steps to address the triple crisis of climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution, destroying our planet. Second, now is the time to renew the social contract between governments and their people within societies, so as to rebuild trust and embrace a comprehensive vision of human rights. People need to see results reflected in their daily lives. This must include the active and equal participation of women and girls, without whom no meaningful social contract is possible. It should also include updated governance arrangements to deliver better public goods. So again, even the UN sees the problems that we're facing. Third, now is the time to end the infodemic plaguing our world by defending a common empirically backed consensus around facts, science, and knowledge. The war on science must end. All policy and budget decisions should be backed by science and expertise, because that's really the reality to which we should be referring, and that's what the environment is forcing us to see today. Fourth, now is the time to correct a glaring blind spot in how we measure economic prosperity and progress. When profits come at the expense of people and our planet, we are left with an incomplete picture of the true cost of economic growth. As currently measured, gross domestic product fails to capture the human and environmental destruction of some business activities. The Secretary General calls for new measures to complement GDP so that people can gain a full understanding of the impacts of business activities and how we can and must do better to support people and our planet. Fifth, now is the time to think for the long term, to deliver more for young people and succeeding generations, to better prepared for the challenges ahead. We also need to be better prepared to prevent and respond to major global risks, such as those that we see today. So, what about global governance? Our world is increasingly globalized and interconnected, but there is no effective mechanism for governance, law, and collaboration at the scale of global challenges and catastrophic risks, whether economic, social, or environmental. So, how can we address the vacuum in global governance? With two Baha'i colleagues, we wrote a book a couple of years ago, Cambridge University Press, on global governance and the emergence of global institutions in the 21st century. It's available on open source online, and we've created a global governance forum to take these ideas forward, and a whole series of working groups and efforts are now trying to begin to put these ideas for the world community to take them forward. Very briefly, the approach is to acknowledge that we need effective global governance with legislative, executive, and judicial functions, as we accept as normal at the national level. But nations will only give up the right to make war in exchange for effective mechanisms of collective security and peaceful settlements of disputes. The gradual development of relevant international institutions and processes will allow people to get some confidence in their effectiveness in reducing national insecurity. We need clearly, carefully coordinated disarmament, trust that justice will be done, but states also have to become trustworthy. That's far from the case today, unfortunately. and we need a collective sense of moral responsibility. All of this is explained in detail in that book for those who are interested. What about environmental governance? This is my own special area of interest. We started environmental governance 50 years ago in 1972, and many things have been accomplished since that time, but we still have not turned the corner towards a better world. The environment is still getting worse. As I mentioned, I attended the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. This is a picture that I took there. And there, you see me on the right, as part of the delegation of the Baha'i international community. Already last October, finally, the Human Rights Council approved the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So this is finally enshrined in international human rights agreements. The United Nations Environment Program recently published a synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature. It's a scientific blueprint for how climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution can be tackled jointly within the framework of Sustainable Development Goals. So again, we know what we need to do. It's all clearly written out by scientists. We're now coming up to Stockholm Plus 50 and 2nd to 3rd of June, where we'll be presenting some of these ideas. We've been rethinking global systems accounting to replace GDP as the primary measure of progress, and the link to a paper I've written on that subject recently. We have a climate governance commission with a number of Baha'is involved and many other leading experts of the world, which is trying to address that particular challenge of better governing a climate crisis. With another Baha'i colleague, we did for the Climate Governance Commission a paper on creating a global environment agency, which would have the ability to actually create and enforce environmental legislation to protect the planetary environment. So again, this is written up for those who are interested in going into more detail. And of course, ultimately, we need more trust and trustworthiness. States must trust that decisions are really taken in the common interest. People must trust that their human rights will be protected. Everyone should be able to develop their full potential to contribute to society. Governments must be trustworthy, with everything founded on justice for all. Sacrifices should be shared equitably, and no one should be left behind. So the pioneer community has told us that against the backdrop of climate change, environmental degradation, and the crippling extremes of wealth and poverty, the transformation from a culture of unfettered consumerism to a culture of sustainability has gained momentum. It is a transformation that will require an earnest examination of our understanding of human nature and of the cultural frameworks driving institutions of government, business, education, and media around the world. Questions of what is natural and just will need to be critically re-examined. The issue of sustainable consumption production will need to be considered in the broader context of an ailing social order, one characterized by competition, violence, conflict, and insecurity, of which it is a part. Progress at the technical and policy levels now needs to be accompanied by a public dialogue among rural and urban dwellers, among the materially poor and the affluent, among men, women, and young persons alike, on the ethical foundations of the necessary systemic change. A sustainable social order is distinguished, among other things, by an ethic of reciprocity and balance at all levels of human organization. Within such an order, the concept of justice is embodied in recognition that the interests of the individual and of the wider community are inextricably linked. The pursuit of justice within a frame of unity and diversity provides a guide for collective deliberation and decision-making and offers the means by which unified thought and action can be achieved. So if you're interested in more, I have several links here to our International Environment Forum with many materials on the subject, the Global Governance Forum, the Governance Commission. So there are many places you can go to if you want to take these issues further. I thank you for your attention. We now have some time for questions and discussion, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can go back and take this further.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Arthur Dahl, for the very comprehensive presentation of with a lot of information. You have been showing all the different crises humanity is going through, including environmental, economic, social, governance, moral, all these crises together. put humanity in its course in great dangers. And you have also offered suggestions about guidance of what is known about what we need to do about all these challenges. A lot is known and a lot of guidance is provided about what needs to be done. It seems that among the crises we're facing is also a lack of capacity to implement a vision that we have, and maybe also to share this common vision that head of states quite easily are ready to sign, but we're really facing the challenge of implementing and bringing the change you're talking about. You also indicated the need for transformation, and I understand the transformation at every level, individual, community, institution. You also mentioned the foundation, the ethical foundations that are needed for change. So all these guidance, we really have a wealth of guidance information to bring all this change. So the floor is also open for the participants to see if there are some questions. There are already some participants were asking if the presentation can be made available. I guess that can be done, I suppose. If there are also questions, they can be put here in the chat box in question and answers. So the presentation will be made available to the Wilmette Institute. And if there are questions, you can put your question in a chat box, and I can look at them. But you can also send your questions by email if you see there's no time for that.
There's already a question in the question and answers from Armin Goshtaspi. He says, scientifically, humans are anatomically herbivores. Man has either sharp nails or claws or teeth or sickles. It's evident that food of man is fruit of vegetation. The WHO 15 years ago said the pandemic is permanent to animal agriculture. What do we have to promote this science? I think it was clearly, and the science shows it's healthy not to eat so much meat. And we sort of have cultivated, a desire for meat. It's ecologically, a great waste because it takes 10 times as many calories to raise an animal for human food as it does to eat the food directly. And if food is going to be short, it also makes sense, and we can be very healthy. There are whole groups, the Sikhs and so on, who live vegetarian or vegan diets and extremely healthy. So it's not something that is necessarily required for health. So I think this is something that part of the problem, of course, is the inertia of, as I mentioned, the economy, which makes more money out of meat, and which and fast food and all other things, which is not looking at properly nourishing people, but what are those things that can make the most profit? And so until we transform the economic system, it's hard for these higher spiritual values to make themselves heard and begin to have some impact. So I think we can certainly contribute from the faith perspectives with respect to this issue, but we also need larger changes in society. And of course, even the pandemic has come because of our invasion of natural areas and the many animal viruses that can easily jump to humans if we continue to go in that direction. So there are also health reasons for turning away from the extensive meat production that we see today.
One question is, as a world citizen, considering all the world problems creating imbalances affecting the world affairs, where should we start from at the individual level to affect change?
Well, obviously we need to start in our own examples, our own lifestyle. There's much that we can do to show that we can be perfectly happy and even happier, perhaps, living a simpler lifestyle and not chasing after the consumer society. So And then, of course, then we can go in our local communities. And that's where one is to be involved in educating children and young people. If they get all started on the right direction and learn values from a young age, then it's much easier for them to continue that later on. When they go beyond childhood and they become young adolescents and they're setting their own values, then we can help them to see through their own group activities the pleasures of being altruistic, helping others. And once they learn that they're happier helping others than just thinking of themselves, then again that helps them to go forward. So there are and so I think gradually we can build momentum from the bottom up, transforming communities around the world and setting examples of better ways of living than what our society is trying to impose on us from outside. And the Baha'i community on a pilot scale is already demonstrating this kind of approach works all around the world in 100 countries. There's a question about Baha'i businesses reflecting the Baha'i view of economics. There are.
Yes.
In fact, we mentioned that I'm also involved in ethical business building at EBPF, which is again association of Baha'is bringing Baha'i values into the business community. And many of them are extremely successful in their own way. Not that they try to grow to be some giant corporations, because that in itself perhaps is in itself unhealthy to do, but in terms of setting an example, making a reasonable living and helping to improve the world, they're doing very well. And there are many others, there are B corporations that are also trying to build some kind of social responsibility into the basic, the DNA of the corporations, and show that there are other ways of meeting needs of the world besides just driving for profit.
There's a question from about the situation in Africa where there is extreme poverty. How can this be implemented when education is a competition of book learning? How do we start at the grassroots? And what is the Baha'i perspective?
Well, the Baha'is are very active across Africa and South Asia and areas full of poverty. In fact, many of the most successful Baha'i communities are in such areas. And there, the Baha'is try to bring in more sustainable agricultural practices, helping to show them by bringing in some science, to complement their traditional knowledge, because things have changed, new diseases have come in and so on. They can help them to see how through, say, agroforestry or permaculture, other techniques, they can produce more of their own food, provide vegetables to provide vitamins and so on and so forth, and consult together. And the whole Baha'i approach to development is not development imposed from outside. Outsiders coming in and short-term spending of money trying to change things, but having communities see their own needs, read their own reality, and with if they need some scientific advice, getting that, and then choose what they need to do to take steps forward. And in many places, the Baha'i communities are setting examples for all those around them, as though rising out of poverty, on their own terms and in a much healthier way than in so many places where development has failed.
Thank you. So there's also one question which is related to hope. How can people be convinced to put the well-being of the common good before their personal profits, selfish interest, and nationalist narrow-mindedness?
That's precisely why we need religion, because the scientific approach by itself doesn't convince people to change their behavior. It's only when they have an appreciation of a higher responsibility than to themselves, whether they learn a love of God, an appreciation of Allah, achieving a more Buddhist approach or whatever. All the faith traditions have taught us that we need to turn out from ourselves, leave behind the selfish side of us, and work for others and develop the higher spiritual qualities. Once you have that framework, then you change the ground rules for people's behavior. As long as they're trapped in a materialistic worldview and see the animal side comes to the top, and that is what dominates. We see that in political leaders, we see that in corporate behavior and so on. So we really have to start changing, changing the very values in society. And even I've worked a lot with system scientists, like those who did the Limits to Growth report. And Nella Meadows wrote a book about how only changing values can change the whole system. Those are the rules which the system operates. If you change the values which it operates, then all the other things follow. So if we can bring in these spiritual values into our societies, into our communities, into our lives, that changes the ground rules by which everybody will be functioning. And the change will come, you might say, naturally after that, as we replace this dysfunctional system, which is collapsing, by a better one to take its place.
Yes, and I think that's very related to another comment where someone was asking to leave us with 3 succinct lessons directed at the human heart. And I think that's what you mentioned, these core spiritual values that are connected with the heart.
Exactly, because that's what changes motivation.
Someone is asking, yes, someone is asking also, what are the main themes of your 2 books, Book on Hope and the one on global governance? So the one on hope probably related to our conversation now.
Yeah, very much so. I sort of, I thought, having spent 50 years depressing people with all the terrible things happening with the environment, how can I give them some hope in the future? And so, it's kind of a voyage through 7 valleys. So what are the environmental problems, and how do we rise out of those problems and find more sustainable solutions? And what are the valley of social problems, and how do we change our social relationships in order to build stronger communities and society? How do we go into the valley of economic problems, and how do we find our way out of those by changing the ground rules of the way the economy is operating? And then it looks at, you might say, the higher spiritual challenges. How do we address our own challenges in our own life, and try to set a better example? And how do we just discover more about that higher purpose, that higher value, whether it be God or Allah, that we should be learning to turn toward and to develop the spiritual qualities that are being taught through all the faith traditions. And then looking at how, with these changes, we can imagine a better future. So that's basically the storyline of the book.
Thank you for this feedback. There's one question that is about practical action. And so can practical action be sustainable and effective in creating lasting without a deepening knowledge of the interconnections of the world materially and ideology, spiritually? I would mention that, for example, people who are able to produce food in a sustainable way, in a small-scale farming, they are actually contributing for this sustainable, because they do respect the soil, they respect the water, they grow food, they serve the community, and even if they don't have a deep scientific knowledge, they do have practical knowledge, which allows them to be of service for humanity. So I don't know, maybe you have other examples.
Well, at a small scale, that works to a certain extent. But then, are they able to pass this on to generations? Are they able to multiply this beyond what they're able to do for themselves? I mean, I've in the past taken part in some very idealistic, organizations that were, looking to transform the world and to make all these changes. And then, in the middle of a major conference, there was a falling out between the organizers, and they marched off the stage in anger because they were driven too much by ego and not just by ideals, and the whole thing collapsed.
Yes.
So, the practical actions only can take us so far. We also need to organize at higher scales to build this up to the global level, and that's where we need to understand the interconnections. People have them. Indigenous people have that sense of interconnections. I mean, I've worked with the Pacific Island peoples for many years, and they don't see themselves as separate from the environment. They're part of it, and they have a deep respect for it. And when they have to take something from it, they ask permission and they thank for it and so on, as you would with any other part of the community. So this sense of interconnection is, you might say, the foundation on which, as we face new challenges, we know how to respond to them.
Yes, interconnectedness, yes, as you mentioned. And also, you also mentioned education, which is really essential for sustainability, because it needs to be passed on to new generations, whatever, especially moral values and practice and so on.
Yeah,
So that
education
also
is fundamental. You can learn as much wisdom as you want. You're going to die someday. And you may take some lessons with you, but everything that you put in your mind is left behind. So the only sustainability in terms of knowledge, culture and science and so on is through education, transferring it from generation to generation. And that requires a certain level of organization to achieve that at all levels.
Yeah, so yes, your presentation is touching on different fields, and there's also economy, of course. One question here is, can the world economies for well-being alliance help governance transition? So that's, I think the person is referring to an organization that is called the Well-Being Alliance.
Well, there are many organizations working in this direction, and they're full of wonderful values, and we need all the partnerships we can. And therefore, I think we should, when we find people who share the same values, let's collaborate together and build momentum. But sometimes if we come from a faith tradition, we may be able to add a little something extra on the motivational side beyond the good intellectual ideas. I don't know this organization, so I can't comment on it particularly, but there are many people, many academics who've written books about the different steps we've taken. But if you don't also bring about that change in values, it only goes so far. Because the question about our book on global governance, it actually goes into detail into the need to fix the UN system, which we see as broken, to get rid of the veto, to replace the Security Council by an executive council that is elected and has no veto, to give it its own financial mechanisms, to repair the various faults built into the charter originally, and to take on the new challenges, such as the environmental governance challenge and others that didn't exist in 1945 when it was adopted. So it's quite a comprehensive review of all the different elements that are needed to bring the United Nations into the 21st century and make it fit for purpose for the society you want to build.
Yeah, I think you're answering partly the question on global governance, where it's asking what is the main theme and approach in your book on global governance?
I talked about one. I better talk about the other one as well.
Yes. Yes. So global governance is really part of the. It's really an important aspect of it, and how to bring change.
And the question about 3 succinct lessons directed at the human heart, that's obviously a difficult one. But I'd say, the first would probably be to acknowledge that it is love that is the most powerful force for positive good. Learning to love the unknown and unknowable that is God. Learning to love whatever messenger you accept who has brought the teachings of God to earth. And then saying, well, this means that you need to apply that in your own life, learning to love every human being, all of nature, all the things that God has created. And I think that applying that sense of love and responsibility at the 3 levels would be what would allow you to live a better life and to help build the world for the future.
And maybe also recognizing that love is a universal force of the universe.
It is, yes, and we can tap into it, and we can then apply it in our own lives and try to follow, in a sense, the pattern, the system that we're meant to be building, which is laid for us in that divine guidance.
So I think we've covered quite a lot of questions. Let me see if there is something, because we're getting close to the end of our webinar.
There's a question about the time frame for the comprehensive social, economic, environmental, and governmental spiritual transformation that is needed. But it's obviously going to come in stages. In the Baha'i view, it may take some centuries to fully achieve, the pattern that Baha'u'llah has brought, what we might call the golden age, of the Baha'i dispensation. But we can already take important steps forward. Already governments need to build what we might call a lesser peace, where a ban war between countries, and we're probably being forced now to recognize that there's a fundamental failure there, and depending on how things unfold in the months or years ahead, that could come quite quickly, particularly if we had a third world war and then had to rebuild after that. It's very hard to predict how quickly that change may come, but that would certainly be a first step. We know we need to very rapidly make changes with respect to like climate change and biodiversity loss, because if we don't bring those changes extremely quickly, we're going to suffer enormous damage and suffering. Hundreds of millions of people physically displaced on the planet in the decades ahead. So those changes need to start immediately and to come in very quickly. And the longer we wait, the stronger will be the pressures to force us to change. I think it's not simply waiting until we're ready to do so. We're being forced by the various events taking place to accelerate this process of change. So let's just hope the sooner the better. Within decades, for some of the most immediate things, we'll hopefully get over the worst and begin to build a new and better world, coming from that. And then it'll take some centuries to put it all together at the planetary scale.
Yes, it does take time. I think we understand we also need to accept that our different generations are needed, and transformation also is carried on from a generation to the next.
Exactly. That's why now that I'm about to turn 80, the time has come to get younger generations following behind me and helping them to stand on my shoulders and race forward. So a lot of my work now is addressed to that end.
So thank you very much, Dr. Arthur Dahl. This was a very deep and thoughtful reflection on the topic. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. And
well, thank you, Laurent, for presiding so well.
Thank you. So let's keep in touch with the Wilmette Institute and with this upcoming course.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.